We're at 12:59.
Come on.
Okay.
Welcome to the webinar. You may begin now.
Good afternoon and welcome to the latest of TVNewsCheck's Working Lunch webinars. This is called Report Card on Race, and I'm Michael Depp, editor of TVNewsCheck. The aim of today's webinar is to assess the progress or lack thereof that the TV industry is making toward the aims of diversity and inclusion. Across American life, the Black Lives Matter movement and protests have underscored the depths of our shortcomings over the past months. And they prompted many industries toward introspection on this front. Today, we'll gauge the depth of that introspection and, more importantly, come away with some concrete actions broadcasters can take to ensure they're honoring the broad part of broadcasters that they're in their name and reflective of the audiences that they serve. I'd like to welcome the Broadcast Education Association for being with us. We're very happy to have them as a co-presenter and to welcome all the student journalists and professors who are here today. And before I introduce our panelists, just a couple of quick notes on how things will proceed. Throughout the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit questions, and you should use the Q&A feature in your Zoom toolbar. Don't wait until the end to do so. We'll be keeping track of your questions as the discussion progresses, and we'll address some of them during the conversation, as well as some time that I'll leave over in the end. We'll also be doing a series of polls as our conversation progresses. They'll pop up on your screen. They're simple to respond to, and we'll share those results along the way. And finally, a video recording of this webinar will be available shortly after we conclude, along with a story tomorrow recapping the highlights in TVNewsCheck. So, all that said, I am pleased to introduce today's panelists. Michelle Duke is president of the NAB Leadership Foundation, and as of earlier this year, the NAB's Chief Diversity Officer. Welcome, Michelle. Richard Dyer is president and general manager of TEGNA's WUSA in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Richard. Sean Lawton is vice president of news at the EW Scripps company. Hi, Sean. And Danielle Wright is vice president of employment and labor law and chief diversity officer at EW Scripps. Welcome to everyone. So as we've talked about before in preparation for this, I want this to be a discussion. So panelists, feel free to jump in and elaborate on your colleagues' points and ask questions of each other as we go along. And without further ado, let's go along. To begin, for anyone who might be skeptical that the television industry has a problem with diversity and inclusion, let's speak to that right off the top. So for each of you, if you could each please speak to how this is a problem. And let's start with you, Michelle.
All right, that's what I get for taking my mute button off. So I would say that, you know, the industry has long prided itself on being a public service to the communities that we serve. And if your newsroom and or your entire organization lacks diversity, then naturally you're creating an opportunity for there to be a gap in terms of your coverage and the service that you can provide. And so, yes, you know, diversifying our staffs is definitely an issue for our industry. Is something we should definitely be focused on, but it doesn't end with recruitment. And I think we'll get into more of the details around just it not being so focused on a recruitment-based solution. It's a cultural solution, it's a retention solution. And so I'll stop there and I'll yield to my other panelists.
Danielle, you want to take that?
Yeah, I think I'll echo to some extent what Michelle said and say there's not enough in front of the camera, not enough behind the camera, not enough across the workforce, not enough that are, you know, seen or heard. But I would also say some of that is because people sort of grow accustomed to running the same plays. They do the same things over and over and over again, and then perhaps expecting a different result. I think there is change, that people are being more intentional, which we're also going to talk about later on, about recruiting and about so many of the other things that Michelle addressed as well. What I would end with is that I think oftentimes we hear about the firsts. In 2020, that starts to get a little old. Too many firsts. In other words, I think it can be a point of sort of dual consciousness, meaning this is the first, weekend anchor, or this is the first midday anchor. And while that may be a point of pride, it's also, I think we have to understand, it's a point of pain, because in 2020, we should be alarmed that there are still so many firsts. I think it's important to break barriers, but if we're still having the same conversations year over year, then that means we need to change sort of methodology, tools, tactics, et cetera.
Richard?
I would echo and add that I heard a politician yesterday say that politics is a reflection of society, not the other way around. So when we start looking at the systemic issues, or when we're talking about gaps in diversity, in a way, it's connected to the society that we serve. And as broadcasters, we have a really, really direct connection to the communities that we serve. And the more we reflect those communities, the better we can serve those communities, and the better our business can be for the communities that we are all a part of. So the conversation about having first in 2020, I agree with Danielle 100%. That should be with an asterisk and a footnote that goes, why?
And Sean?
I think it's clear we have a lot of work to do. I think, I look at this in a couple of different ways. First, in the on-air roles, the most visible. I think we've focused on this for a while. I think we've done an okay job. Yeah, I think that's been something that we've focused on for a long time. Where I think we have a lot of work to do is the editorial decision process and the leadership. The number of general managers, the number of news directors and assistant news directors. And, the reason that's, so important is obvious. Those are the decisions. Those are the stories we're covering, how we're going to go about it. And there's no way that implicit bias doesn't work its way into that. So when I look across the landscape, that's the biggest challenge I see is how do we diversify the people who are making the decisions in our newsrooms every day?
And we're going to talk a lot about leadership, especially at the front end of this conversation. So I think that's a good baseline to start from. Another good baseline is just some data. So Michelle, I just want to ask if you can put some data on top of the problem right away. For a story that I did not too long ago myself, I turned to a 2019 RT-DNA study to try to get some figures. And it seemed to show some very incremental, and we might say very slight improvements. Among employees overall, it found 22.8% of people of color, up 1.4% over the previous year. I didn't find any 2020 data yet. Can you just sort of highlight what are some of the key statistics, or where perhaps are we lacking some important statistics to even work from?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that RT-DNA has done this study for a number of years, I think over 20 years at this point, and kudos, frankly, to the broadcasters that respond, because in some instances, they're responding quite candidly about the fact that they don't have any diversity in their newsrooms or in their general managers, as it has been included more recently in the survey. And as you said, Michael, the increases have been incremental, but they're not yet on par with the rising population of people of color in the US. And so obviously, that is, if parity is the goal rather for the industry, then there's some work to be done. I think when I glanced at the 2019 numbers last, that the highest increases were in Hispanics and African Americans. But if you look at Asian Americans and Native Americans, the numbers were pretty flat. And so obviously there, again, is a need for outreach in these communities, and education, if you will, about opportunities in our industry. But there's also a need for retaining the talent that we've had, because we don't do, if you will, a survey, if you ask about what's lacking on individuals who leave the industry necessarily. And so as we're filling the gap you know, what's being siphoned off, if you will, in terms of talent in our industry. And so I would say that might be an interesting study. And the other thing is, while it would be great, I think, to have a study of all of the business operations, if you will, of station and the industry, I don't think we need one to tell us that engineering and sales, you know, are opportunities for us to fill some gaps in terms of diversity. And that's why we've created some of the initiatives that we have at the Leadership Foundation.
So we don't really have a lot of exit data then from people who are, that they've been recruited perhaps, but not retained. We don't, that's not really central.
I'm not aware of any. I would yield to my colleagues in case they are.
Or to the professors perhaps who are in the audience we need to start to get some of that. I want to just follow on that RTDNA study. News directors of color saw some improvement in representation in 2016, 2018, looks like it skipped 17, and 2019. And GMs of color rose to just over 10%. Sean, you've already touched on the leadership issue here. So to all of you, where should those GM and news director numbers be that we could consider them to be strong or healthy? Or what are some KPIs that we should be focusing on here?
I think I'll start. I think it has to be higher, but I think it is also specific to the station or group to assess for themselves. So I think we can always look at RTDNA numbers as a baseline. For me, I think that is one variable to consider. In other words, I think it's very easy to embrace, and I do say this as well, which is we should reflect the communities where we live, work, and play. However, taken to its logical extension, then if you have a massive footprint, much like Scripps does, we're 60 stations in 42 markets, then what that means is for markets where there's not a lot of diversity, then what you're saying is then it's okay for on-air talent to look just like that community, when really as a company, we may have a broader goal. So I think it's one thing to use a standard, but it also has to be consistent with your values as a company and what you want it to look overall as a picture.
I'm glad you actually spoke to that, because I had a question sent in advance of that, was putting that very same question about what if you have a community that's got very little minority representation. So thanks for that. Does everyone else want to take that question?
I'll just follow, along the same line. I think this isn't going to fix immediately. This isn't, I'd love to say, hey, we can come back in 12 months and we're where we need to be. I think we all know it's not going to be that quick. But I do think, I know in our company, and I think a lot of other ones, it's meaningful forward progress. That is, we track time each year. We're getting better and better and working closer to the point where we're more balanced with, with the population across the nation.
And I'd only add that, companies like Scripps, if you look at Meredith, if you look at Hearst, they have their independent key performance indicators. For us, clearly we're not, we may begin providing those types of resources for organizations as they begin to consider what performance indicators they want to put in place. But for us, we measure success with our programs. And just at the top, I would be remiss if I don't mention the Broadcast Leadership Training Program, of which Richard is a graduate of the first class. That program is designed for senior level managers to move into more executive positions, ownership, and or at the corporate level. And we've had much success with it. We have over 344 participants or graduates. We have 19 in the current class, and that number includes those. And I did a rough estimate. We're in the process of gathering data about the group right now, but I did a rough count of how many of those were general managers, if you will, of color, and there were 29. So 29 of the people out of that 340 something are general managers of color. And that's just specific to television. If I were to include radio in it, the number grows exponentially, but I thought it would be significant to share because we can measure the impact that we have on the industry based on what the program, the success of that program, and the other programs that we do. But
one thing I would add, Michelle brought up the general manager population of African-American general manager population. The NABJ conference was held virtually just last week. And as part of that, the group of African-American general managers got together to provide some additional leadership discussions and webinars and content for NABJ. And it was the first time that we had done that as a group. The group was 16. there are about 1,500 TV stations across the country. That number is less than 1/10 of 1%. So when we start talking about metrics in jobs that matter in terms of decision making, that number is what it is. It's a very, very unacceptably low number, and we've been after that number for quite some time.
So to begin to address the problem substantively, how important is C-suite buy-in? How much does this effort need to come from the top? And are we seeing that among CEOs? And just before you speak to that question, actually, I want to put this to our audience as our first poll question. Is your CEO actively committed to promoting inclusion and diversity at your group? And does your company have a written diversity strategy? Is it in the hands of all your hiring managers? So if you attendees want to speak to that, and then if everyone can talk here in the panel to C-suite buy-in.
I'll start. At TEGNA, Dave Luigi is absolutely 100% guiding and leading the effort for diversity and inclusion. TEGNA has a strong reputation as a great place to work for the LGBTQ community. We also have gotten some best places to work awards, top 500 or 50, I think, places to work. The issues elevated with a level of urgency this spring. And from the top down, what we have decided is that we want to take and leverage this moment and turn it into a movement. And for us, we have different ways for all of us. Scripps has a way to get there. It's kind of like Waze and Google Maps. You can put in the same location, the same destination, but we have different ways to get there. Ours is going to be more of a organic intercompany look first so that we can understand what our issues are. And then we're going to build based off of how we've done innovation summits in the past, a real clear assessment of where we stand, what's working, what's not working, what can we do better, and then build from there organically. Other companies have other models.
Danielle and Sean, I've talked to Adam Simpson, your CEO, about this. He's very emphatic about it, but can you tell us about Scripps? And your
Sure, I'll begin and say certainly at Scripps, absolutely Adam is behind the effort. And I would say overall, without C-suite buy-in, I think the efforts and tactics are doomed for failure because it signals a commitment on a large scale, on a high scale within the company that EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion matters. But I think that's just a first step. In other words, I think you have to make some of the other things that we talked about, which is the reporting structure, the funding, making sure it's not just a figurehead, it's someone that actually has influence within the organization. It's making sure that at a high level, at a senior leadership level, whether you sign the CEO pledge or you require your direct reports to embed EDI in their metrics, in their performance appraisals. It's more than just having that person with the CEO or C-suite commitment. It's also all the sort of the attendant consequences. And another thing that I'll end with, because I'm sure Sean has something to add, which is, you know, for those who may be naysayers or obstructionists, that's where you need the folks to block and tackle, to pave the way for you, to make it smooth so that you can go in and do the work and collaborate as necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, you know, Adam, the reason it's so important to have CEO, not just buy-in leadership on it, is, you know, there's a lot of work that this entails. There's a lot of cost, there's a lot of effort, there's a lot of time. These are very intentional efforts to fix these issues. And I think, you know, one of the advantages, you know, with Adam, with his roots in news, is he knows the impact of what diversity means to newsrooms and how it impacts communities. And I think with, you know, and the same with Dave Luigi and a couple others in the business, I think that level of understanding, I think, is critically important. The knowledge of how the diversity within the newsroom impacts the news product and how it impacts the community is so critical.
Mm-hmm. Michelle, do you agree?
I completely agree with everything that's been said. I think you know, Danielle put it best with the block and tacklers, the people being engaged at every level of the organization. So yes, you definitely need the C-suite buy-in, but it's an organization-wide commitment that just starts there.
Mhm, mhm. Well, one of the steps that organizations can also take to ameliorate the problem is to hire a chief diversity officer. We have two of you in this conversation. How does this position help? And how can you, in your jobs, substantively help to enact change?
I think we clicked at the same time, so I'll go first, Michelle. I would say that, for us, as I repeated or said before, is that it signals commitment. It gives someone within the organization sort of the power to ask for and evaluate data, to, as Richard talked about, go on these listening tours to find out, making sure that you understand what has been done in the past, and building upon what is for Scripps a very strong foundation, and as evidenced by recent events, to pivot as necessary. In other words, we had sort of the perfect storm of things that were occurring. We had the pandemic, and then as a result of the killings of George Floyd and Arbery and Breonna Taylor, we had systemic racism rear its ugly head again. And so what that required was for those that were in a CDO role, this was a moment and I don't like to think of it as exploit, because I think it's a terrible thing to exploit what happened, but to capitalize on some of that forward moving momentum to enact change, and to push initiatives that may have been, sort of on pause because of business continuity, but push it to the forefront.
And Michelle, you're sort of new in this post relatively.
Yes, and I shared Daniel's opinion there. This was something that we've been discussing at NAB for a while, and as she's just said, the timing just really was, it just culminated in resulted in this role. And so I think that it couldn't be a better time to really zero in and focus on what we need to get done as an organization, as an industry. I see the Chief Diversity Officer position as somewhat of a, if you will, not to at all belittle it, but it's a facilitation type of position. You, even yourself, Michael, in this conversation, you may offer your opinions, you offer your direction, you continue and facilitate the discussion. You also do some of the work, but you do not do the work alone. It requires a commitment from everyone across the organization. So it's not really an opportunity for a company to say, okay, we've hired our chief diversity officer, we've checked that box, we're good.
Solved. Yeah.
We've got it covered, because in many instances, and we discussed this recently in a different conversation, that individual is a person of color. And so putting the burden, if you will, on that person of color to get all the work done, if you will, for the industry that may have years of things to course correct is a little bit, it's a little bit ominous, if you will, for that individual. Right. And I think it's, short-sighted for the organization. It's an everybody job, if you will.
The position is proliferating. I said just this week, NBCU stations elevated Enzio Williams to, not quite, his title isn't Chief Diversity Officer, but it's a SVP covering the area. So it does seem to be expanding a bit. I think we have our first poll results ready. I'm not sure if we can bring them. Yeah, here we go. So we've got our first answers. Company CEO actively committed to promoting inclusion and diversity. We've got a majority yes at 77, an alarming 11% no, and not sure at 12. And does the company have a written strategy in the hands of hiring managers? That's 33% saying yes, and 25% no, 42% not sure. Probably we can do better on both of those numbers, I would think. I want to tackle diversity and inclusion in some different pieces now, beginning with recruitment. And we're going to focus on the life cycle past that. What's not working in the recruitment process right now? What steps concretely can people come away from this and take away as improvements on that process, just at the first end of it? Anyone can jump into this too.
One of the things that I'll go back to what Danielle said earlier, there's a lot of legacy behavior that needs to be modernized through how we go about recruiting, how we go about retaining, how we go about developing. Our business is relatively small. It's a cliche that it's 6 degrees of separation from a bunch of people in our business. But what tends to happen is you recycle the same dance steps every time you go for a hire. You call somebody that you used to know, or somebody makes a recommendation. Companies are modernizing and expanding their footprint on recruiting, but the first thing we have to do is modernize our recruiting so that we're casting a wider net and looking at the opportunities for talent with a much broader lens. That's absolutely step one.
I think one of the challenges is you still hear the reason for not making a diverse hire is the fit isn't correct. And I think, we have to come to the realization that when fit is the reason, we probably need to do a little bit more self-exploration about what's really going on there, because I think this is where that implicit bias piece can unwillingly and unknowingly come into play. And I think that happens more often than we realize.
I wanted to drill down on some of the information that Richard shared in terms of recruiting. I think specifically it's sort of fishing in the same pond. When we look to our folks to leverage their circles of influence and affluence, and we keep getting the same type of folks, which is somewhat inevitable and should not be unexpected. I think another tangible thing that should be reconsidered is our metrics that push time to fill positions, because it doesn't take into consideration areas that may be geographically undesirable or positions that are traditionally difficult to fill, like producers. And so then if you have someone that is being driven by numbers, that they have to get it done within a certain period of time, that's going to drive a very different type of behavior. They're just going to look for a candidate, as opposed to, do we have a diverse slate? Is it just going to take more time because of the area that we're recruiting in? I think much like we do with business strategy, where there's a refresh every year, or a group of folks that sort of take a look at it with a whiteboard and redesign that. I'm not saying, flip the script every year from a recruiting strategy, but I do think taking a fresh look at it, maybe with a different set of eyes, with an inclusive team, would be helpful.
And for all of you also, is COVID-19 creating additional headwinds for this right now on the recruitment side? I know onboarding people remotely has not been the easiest process for anybody.
Actually, in a way, because of the disruption, there's certain job categories where there's actually a wealth of talent that's available, because none of us are doing an excessive amount of hiring in 2020. But when we do have openings and we do get the green light to hire, there have been some really good candidates available. We're in a disrupted economy, but the available talent actually has expanded a little bit in 2020.
And then, Michelle, you touched on this, but I'd just like to go a little more detail. Some of the areas recruitment-wise that have been particularly elusive to diversification, like engineering and sales. Can you point to some ways in which you're trying to make some inroads?
Yeah, I was thinking on that previous question while everyone was answering about recruitment. It's definitely a diversity issue, but that's just exacerbated by the fact that it's an industry-wide issue in terms of recruiting for engineering, if you will. Maybe not so much in sales, but maybe in sales. And part of it is an education issue. Just when I speak to these students in particular, or people in other industries, when we're attending conferences, they just aren't aware of the fact that there are sales and engineering opportunities in our industry. And so that is a first step, if you will. And what we did was a survey of sales students, and we're conducting one now with engineering students, and we juxtaposed that over what broadcasters are doing to attract sales students, if you will. And we'll do the same with engineering. And the gaps were just like, whoa. I mean, they expect one thing, we're offering another. They look at our pay structure in some instances, and they're like, oh my God, no, that's too frightening for me. We work diligently to show them the beauty and the if you will, the glory of the industry, because it's still a sexy industry, if you ask me. And a lot of times they shy away. So when we are trying to attract students of color in particular, and we're going to organizations like the National Association or National Society of Black Engineers, or SHEPI, which is the Hispanic engineers, or even SWE, the women engineers, and National Sales Network, all of these organizations that have the talent that we need to attract to our industry, we're doing this two-step dance. First is, hey, did you know that, you could actually sell or do engineering in the industry? And then it's the convincing, hey, we have this program that's a bridge program to help you get into the industry. But then it's like, oh, well, yeah, this is how we pay now, but it's fun, And so when you're doing that dance, and particularly with students of color, I think that may, in some instances, have other factors to consider as opposed to just always pursuing what they're passionate about, or may find other industries to pursue what they're passionate about. Then we're up against a little bit of a wall. And I just think, as collectively as an industry, we have to shine a better light on what we do and really make a concerted effort to go and attract these students.
And Richard, we had talked about this also earlier, and you, in our preparations for the talk, we really need to become a destination for minority recruits to the industry, find future talent potentially coming in. Do you have thoughts about how we can do that better?
Well, we have to first have the intention, and then we have to have the action to back it up. One of the things that Michelle reminded me of was several years ago, I was at a conference, and it was an Urban League conference in Cincinnati, and we were hosting some STEM students. And there was a presentation by a guy who worked at General Electric Aviation. They have a plant in Cincinnati. And I asked him, I said, when do you start recruiting engineers? And he said, the third grade.
Yeah.
Because when students have that kind of special light about them, they see themselves as essential to keeping that light on for as long as possible. What we have done, and Michelle's done a great job at NAB, is we start inserting ourselves into college recruitment too late. We do it in their senior year, but the cream of the crop students are already off the board. So they get involved really around their sophomore year. Once you get through your freshman year and you start to kind of lock into a line of work, we have to be there earlier. And I know that's something that Michelle is going to spearhead for the industry as well.
I want to drop our second poll question right now to the audience, if we can get that up, which is, does your company make clear, active efforts to retain minority employees and show a path for their advancement? And I want to put really that question to our panelists as well. I mean, it's not just about recruitment, but it's also about an employee's entire life cycle at the company. So can any of you speak to how that needs to be framed in terms of promoting retention and inclusion once a new hire is brought onto the company? Anyone can jump in on this.
I think it's a very, very intentional effort. I mean, it was probably about 2 or 3 years ago where we looked across who our news directors were, and we weren't satisfied at all with the level of diversity. Then we looked at our executive producer and assistant news director ranks. There was a lot more diversity there. So we brainstormed and we came up with a program where we brought in a bunch of our assistant news directors and did sort of a training program. We gave them exposure to finance. We gave them exposure to how sales works. We gave them exposure to, a broader view of the business with the goal of really enticing them into the ideas of upper management. Because we know once you make it to a news director position, general manager and other jobs become available. And of that group, off the top of my head, we brought 10 people in, 8 of whom were diverse, and I think 5 or 6 of those people are running newsrooms in our company now. So I mean, I think it takes, and when you have that story to sell, it makes it easier to bring in other people into lower levels of the company, knowing that you put your money where your mouth is, and you don't just talk, you actually, make those kinds of advancements with a commitment to people. So I think it's really important.
Anybody else want to talk to that life cycle?
I think, recruiting usually gets the responsibility and the blame. And when really, to Michelle's point, it's everyone's responsibility. So yes, they may get we may reach the D. We can check the box. We've got folks that look different, are both alike and dissimilar. But it's also the piece about, when you talk about life cycle, it's more than just getting folks in the door. It's what happens once they're here. What are we doing from a mentoring standpoint? What are we doing for advocacy or sponsorship do we have specialized development programs for diverse talent to make sure that once they're here that we retain them? So it's more than just, you know, the front end. It's also what happens in the interim, which is really critical to ensuring that folks don't just, you know, plop in for, you know, a temporary helicopter in temporarily, but also plant some seeds and grow within the organization.
In the interest of time, I just want to shift on to something that one of our questioners here has asked about, the problem of implicit bias. Let's define it. What is it, and how do so many other problems cascade from it? If anybody wants to take that.
You know, the way we're, I'm sorry, go ahead, Richard.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's what we come to the table with. You know, it's the things that we've just been exposed to and seen and experienced that are part of our decision-making process that we probably aren't aware of. And it's, and we're all programmed differently. And we all, you know, one thing we've learned as we've talked through this, everybody lives the same experience differently. And it affects all the decisions we make. And until you're aware of what that is and what it means in your actions and decisions, it's really hard to address it in a meaningful way. So if you're in a role of hiring somebody and you have those implicit biases, can really work against you in terms of trying to hire a more diverse staff.
Do the rest of you find that this is sort of an existential problem at the top of many problems?
It's one that builds on the fact that fundamentally people hire in a comfort zone. They want to hire people that they're comfortable with. And my non-scientific description of that is, if you look at who does most of the hiring in the United States, it's going to be white men. They're going to be the core. So if you look at it as a series of concentric circles, the closer you get to the core, the higher level of comfort there is, the wider the circle is, the whiter it is color-wise. But as you expand out to more and more broader circles, they get darker. So you may have white men are most comfortable hiring other white men. That's the next circle out. Those white men are comfortable hiring daughters and mothers, right? So white women get a break. Then you start to see, as the circles get more broad, you get to see a little bit more colorization come in. That is what Sean was talking about in terms of hiring for fit. When you're talking about stuff that's subjective, that's driving decisions, that's when we start to have the implicit bias come in to play have a negative consequence on our diversity and inclusion goals.
Sean, I want to tackle the specific news side of this in a little bit more detail. I know that when Scripps began to engage the issue, it made a number of changes to newsroom practices, but those weren't so much top-down as determined at the level of individual newsrooms. Can you talk about that process and some of the concrete changes that came out of that as a result?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it really started on the audience side of things for us. We started, 5 years ago, 2015, we really decided we need to know a lot more about our news audience than traditional news research was telling us, and not, whose people turn to for severe weather coverage. We needed to know what was going on in the lives of our consumers. And so we began a different approach to research where we sat in people's home for 3-hour conversations. And as we went through the process, as we were in homes of people of color, we began to notice there was something wrong. And that led to a study in 2018 where we focused exclusively on Black news viewers and sort of their attitudes toward local news and what was going on. And that's when we discovered a lot. And we looked at, as their attitudes toward the news were so concerning to us, we looked at what are we doing in the news that leads to those decisions. And we continued following that back. And then where we ended up was that newsroom leadership mix and what that has meant to our industry over a long time. And listen, I was a news director for 17 years. I almost, with a handful of exceptions, I worked mostly with other white managers. All my general managers were white men. That's just the way it was accepted for a long time. And as we looked at how do we really begin to impact this and change it, it has to start there. And you look at the recruiting efforts as we talk about it. It's not just post the jobs and just focus more on hiring diverse people. You got to build programs. You got to get to people earlier. You have to have very intentional efforts to bring people into your organization in different capacities. And if you're not getting the pipeline that you need, you have to create one. And that's where we've been, really fortunate to have the support of the company to take some of these different pathways, because it's amazing how bringing diversity into the newsroom management mix changes everything. And even just changing the conversations that take place in the newsroom every day.
And on that, you have actual things in the news product have changed. At some stations, there are no more mugshots being used. In others, I know that I've talked to some of your news directors and your GMs where there's a concerted effort to go into communities as news gatherers where they weren't going very often, and making regular trips, creating, having new sources for stories. You always go to the same kind of sources for different stories, making an intentional effort to. Can you talk a little bit to some of those things too?
Yeah, it's a few things that it's amazing what they've led to in our industry. When you start auditing your product, how often are stories where you use mugshots featuring African-American suspects? How often is a person other than a white man used as an expert in stories and newscasts? How often are positive stories you do featured from the African-American community or the Hispanic community or the gay and lesbian community? When you start really auditing this and looking at it closely, which I do think to be a news director in 2020, you have to now do, you really start getting to some findings that I think will surprise you. And when you come to that realization, you start realizing you have to attack the systems in your newsroom. All the way we used to do things and the context we have and the people we always go to just leads us to the same thing. And it's very destructive in the eyes of a lot of news consumers. We had no idea the magnitude of the distress that those systems were causing. So we've changed a lot of those in the company.
I have to apologize for the apocalyptic thunderstorm now happening behind me. If we can get that last poll result up, I'd like to see that. So just come back to it. Does your company make clear active efforts to retain minority employees, show a path for their advancements? 39% yes, 31% no, and 29% not aware. Also not fantastic numbers there. So that's interesting to look at. We have some great questions coming in. I want to just take one of them right now to kind of chip away at the fantastic questions that are coming in. And this, I think, would be to anybody here. Would you recommend station groups have heart-to-heart conversations with the minorities in their ranks, hear their stories, understand the added pressures that the employees are under on a daily basis? What are your thoughts about that? Good idea?
That's exactly what we're going to do. As we talked about earlier, companies have different pathways to get to those answers. We're going to go directly to our diversity and inclusion work group at TEGNA. What we're going to do, we have a broad group of folks that have been represented in the company. We're going to focus on the Black and Latino employee experience, and we're not going to have a management heavy process. We are taking what we learned from our innovation summits, where we have a ground up organic conversation, a safe space to hear the employee experience directly from those, not in management, but those who are working as part of a broader team. That process is going to give us a very clear idea of what the issues are. And then we, as Danielle said earlier, can facilitate those issues in a way that they get addressed constructively while people still feel that they have a safe space where they can express with their hearts and their minds exactly what's going on inside the company. So yes, going directly to the people is exactly what we're doing.
I would say from Scripps level, it happened both organically within stations. Folks were doing it on their own, and it was also a facilitated process. So we have actually done those. Over the course of 33 days, we had 15 town halls, 3 of which were dedicated to issues addressing journalists of color. It was led by an African-American news director. It subscribes to many of the notions that Richard talked about, which was not having this big, heavy, overarching arm listening in, but allowing folks a forum to express their concerns about not just what's trending because of the racial unrest, but what this meant to journalists as a whole in terms of their professional and their personal worlds colliding. And so the one thing that I will say is I think it's important to offer this space, but it should not be a one and done. We called them courageous conversations. Everyone's going to come up with some type of nomenclature that speaks to them. But for us, it's not a flash in the pan. It will be conversations that are ongoing, and we're building on those. So we've already talked about implicit bias. We had a speaker that came in and did a webinar. Our next session will be on allyship. So we're building on that, continuing to have those conversations, because I think you don't want to lose your credibility by making it seem like it's reactive. It's got to be something that you're committed to doing going forward.
And you had begun this process at Scripps a couple of years. This wasn't just in response to the moment. Are those town halls, are they happening at every station? Or are you kind of slowly getting to every station with that process?
So we did them, I think, at an enterprise level. So we had 10% of our workforce that voluntarily opted in. And then based on the fact that we have two divisions, stations are doing it on their own. So they're taking it upon themselves to have these conversations. We actually had one of our properties that had a podcast with several of the journalists that did a podcast on what their experiences were like as a result of covering the unrest related to George Floyd. So I think it's happening from an organized standpoint. In other words, the chief diversity officer is involved, but they're also happening all across the stations, from inclusion councils and diversity committees. And so it's something that's really exciting.
And it does seem to be committee based at Scripps. So from my conversations with people at different stations, those committees were comprised of a wide cross section of each station, and a lot of people had buy-in. I mean, everyone really seemed to be very much on board and very excited about the work that they were doing there, and that they could point to results like some of the ones Sean just talked about a couple of minutes ago. And to come back to that point and to kind of put that to you, Richard, I spoke recently with the VP of News at TEGNA, Ellen Crook. She was very emphatic that this is an issue across the group, that it's a priority in the news product, that we see more of what we hadn't seen before. Where are you seeing, I mean, you've been in the company for a while, where are you seeing concretely changes there?
I want to tap into something Sean said, and we often talk about diversity in the cultural mix of the people in our newsroom. The next important part of it, especially on the editorial part, is the inclusion part. It's valuing the voices and giving them a place where they get their ideas, their opinions, even if they're not aligned with traditionally what we might consider the way we approach a news story. You have to value those voices. It's not just, if you have a diverse group, you also have to support the voices. So we try to have a very, very dynamic embracing of all the different voices that get amplified inside that newsroom. You first start with having the diverse folks in the newsroom, and then you have to give them the respect and the dignity and the expectation that their voice matters. And that's the part that begins to influence the editorial process in a powerful way.
Mm-hmm. As I mentioned just before, Scripps' efforts preceded the surging Black Lives Matter movement and the protests, but they've also certainly, this moment has underscored a sense of urgency. I wonder, to all of you, how likely is it that there will be a sustained focus on this issue? I mean, is there a danger that broadcasters can pay lip service to this idea and kind of wait for the moment to pass and go back to business as usual?
Let me just make one point on this in a different way. Right after George Floyd, we had just a plethora of companies come out with solidarity statements. And I felt the pressure at our station. Dave Luigi felt the pressure at TEGNA. And to Dave's credit, he resisted a solidarity statement in the moment, but instead focused on the long game. And everything that we're talking about is the long game. It is not a moment, it's a movement. So when we can look at our own news cycles and anticipate that what's red hot and on fire right now, by the time you get after Labor Day, may not even be on the radar. It's the same possible fate of this moment, but you have to put in, first of all, it's a process of months and years. It's not a weeks-long process. It's not one event. It's a series of events. And I think, to Danielle's point, that's their approach. That's all of our approaches. So playing the long game is the only game that's going to win over time.
And before anybody else, and I'd like to hear from the rest of you on this, I want to drop the last of our poll questions, which is how likely is it that your company will stay focused on diversity and inclusion efforts after the current protests may quiet down? But I'd like to hear from the rest of you. If Danielle, you want to take that?
I think it's inevitable that the news cycle will change. I think it is not inevitable that the commitment of companies will change. I very much embrace the principle that Richard talks about, that it's a movement and not a moment. I think that this is an opportunity to continue sort of that forward moving momentum. I like to take a page out of Walt Disney and say, keep moving forward. That we will continue to do what we have been doing. I think to your earlier question about will folks just sort of bury their head in the sand, that ostrich approach will not work. I mean, we're seeing that the generation that certainly comprises much of our workforce is not one that will sit idly by. They are the ones that are going to call you out. They're going to ask questions. They're going to stay noisy. And it's incumbent upon anyone to not just react, but be more intentional about their efforts and committed, as Richard says, for the long term.
We have some great questions coming in, so I want to speak to a couple of these right now. So question really, I guess, for you, Danielle, and perhaps Michelle. As diversity officer, do you personally investigate the elimination of a person of color from their leadership job to uncover possible bias and discrimination from HR, GM, or other managers? Most times, this person says people of color need to be twice as good to get the benefit of the doubt than what others receive, and fit becomes a problem with bias. Do you have a response to that?
I'll just go and say I'm a comma girl. So I head up both employment and labor law for the company. I wear that hat, and I'm also the chief diversity officer. So it's inevitable that any type of termination at a senior level would be evaluated by my portion of the business.
Mm-hmm. Michelle?
I think that's just good bit that, you know, for any individual who leaves, you know, we have things like exit interviews and so forth, and particularly when you have an executive or a senior level, or really at any level, you know, if you're seeing an exodus in particular of people of color, then you certainly want to get down to the bottom of it and assess what's going on at an organizational level and address it. And to the earlier question, I think both Richard and Danielle really nailed it. I mean, this is hard work. You know, I had a conversation with a woman yesterday, who's a Georgetown professor that has done this, you know, for a great portion of her career. And she made a poignant statement about the organizations that will continue to do this work are not the ones that were concerned about the PR play. They're the ones that are concerned about structural change. And so I think that will start to ferret out as time passes.
One more audience question I just want to put to everybody. Why isn't implicit bias training, why is it not required along with other HR related information skills? Or is it? Is it starting to become more standard, or if we're excluding it, why would that be?
It is absolutely becoming essential. It's essential in what we're doing, because we have a special responsibility as journalists to make sure that we're educated and we're elevating the awareness. And then we can hold each other accountable if everybody has been trained in the same way and exposed to the same information. It's absolutely essential. And one of the planks of our diversity efforts is unconscious and implicit bias, because that can come from hidden places. And awareness is a key part of that training, and we have to make it essential.
We've mandated it across Scripps, and I think one of the things it does that's so beneficial is it brings everybody into the same language. You know, it makes people a little more comfortable having those uncomfortable conversations that are so important to have if we're going to really make meaningful change in this.
I want to take on some more audience questions, but before that, I want to make sure to ask each of you something a little bit more personal here. I mean, starting with Richard, you've had a long career at stations. Personally, has it been hard for you in this industry? Do you feel that palpably there's something different about this moment right now? Can you kind of give us a personal perspective on this?
Well, the optimism has to endure. So we take this moment and we try to leverage it and continue to use it as a springboard towards opening up more and more doors. But I'll take you back very quickly. I've been in this business a long time. I've been a general manager for 19 years. And I was in a meeting of general managers in a company in 2004. And we got a very impassioned plea from the CEO about this room doesn't reflect the communities that we serve, and we're going to do something about it. And there were 2 African-American general managers in the room out of 32. And so, great person, we took him at his word. 11 years later, that same meeting in 2015, there still was the same 2 African-American general managers in the room. However, the room had changed because there were more white women in the room as general managers. So it's a process, again, going back to the concentric circles of comfort. So once we started changing the room up, we got more women in the room, which is great progress, but we still have a long way to go based on the numbers overall in our industry.
Oh, and I want everyone to speak. Danielle, can you take that too, please?
So the question is about, how has this personally impacted me, and do I think there's something different? I sure hope so. I would say that this is the first time in a long time where I've seen people from different walks of life, hand in hand, arm in arm, galvanized for racial justice and basic humanity. And so to see it happen, just sort of ripple across the United States and then also internationally, that was profound to me. I think personally, this was the first time in my career where the sort of personal and professional, as I talked about before, collided in a way that I did not anticipate. The feelings that I had, we're all now proud graduates of Zoom University. And I can remember after the first set of protests, I was not certain I could go camera on in my first meeting. I was uncertain because I knew that there might be some expectation that I would be the spokesperson. This is all in my head, not because someone shared this with me, but this is what I was thinking. Maybe I'll be the spokesperson, or maybe people will just gloss it over. I am fortunate and proud to know that that was not the experience that I had. But I know that I had a lot of angst about, what I could do. Now, here's what I understand about my role as the Chief Diversity Officer, the second half of the comma, is that I can influence change. And so I'm very comfortable in the space in which I dwell. It's a space where I feel like I can influence, that I can collaborate, that I can partner across the organization. So yes, there are feelings about what the moment meant to me personally, but it's also the fact that I think that there will be something different this time. I have to believe that. The optimist in me requires that, because to live in a space where you feel sort of on attack, under attack, is not ideal.
Michelle, is the optimist in you responding to the moment in the same way?
Yeah, it is. I'm moved by your comments, Danielle, and I was thinking, I hope I don't have to follow that, but yes, I am optimistic. I came up in this industry, frankly, on the newspaper side. I started in a program that was called a minority youth program, where the newspaper industry was really looking to diversify its ranks. And so from that and running the program, then moving into diversity work in around 1998 in the newspaper side, and then later on the broadcast side, I participated in numerous conversations with a lot of the same folks. And they're always starting like, oh, here we are having this conversation again. We're still having the conversation. And it just, it's almost like, you almost feel like, well, yeah, we are still having the conversation. You find yourself saying it and you're like, why are we still just having the conversation? But now I feel like there's been some movement as a result of the conversation. And it's as Richard articulated, it's a movement. It's not just a conversation with a little bit of fix here and a little bit of fix there. And so, yeah, I'm pretty optimistic about the change.
And Sean, you touched on this before in your experience being a white manager in a room full of white men being all the decision makers. You've also had a long career in this business. So do you feel too that you're noticing something palpable right now that may be more permanent?
Yeah, I've sat in plenty of meetings with middle-aged bald white men. I think, listen, I think, I've been, I can't tell how many times over the years I was in meetings where I one example I was given years ago, we were looking at, we're having a problem with trying to bring African-American women into our 5 o'clock news. And it was a group of, 6 middle-aged white guys. And it's like, hey, what's wrong here? I do think this has staying power. And I think it's because of a couple of things. I think I think we've taken the tough step of having the hard conversations as an industry, and I think it has to continue. But I think the second point that's just as important, and this began even before the George Floyd murder, but has continued since, and that's the audiences are demanding it of us. For anybody who answers phones or emails at TV stations or looks at posts on social media, we incorrectly use a mugshot the way we shouldn't be doing it anymore. They call us out on social media. They publicize it. It's and these are important steps. So I think those are all things that weren't happening before that have grown very loud, and I think give us a really good chance of making these changes sustainable.
We have our last poll question back here. How likely is the company to stay focused on diversity inclusion efforts? Highly likely, 71%. So I think there is a shared sense of optimism with our audience as well. We're running out of time, and so I just wanted, this webinar has been called Report Card on Race, really in terms of how we have progressed in terms of diversity or not. And so giving grade, a letter grade, I'd like each of you to give us what grade are we at right now? What grade can we realistically aspire to by the end of this year? Danielle, can you take that first, please?
I was so hoping you wouldn't go with me first, but I'll begin. I think I would say the industry deserves a B- right now. And I think that's largely driven by the experience that I have at Scripps. So I know that there are efforts that have been underway, that are planned. But I still think I'm a hard grader is what I would say. So I think a stretch, we need to move towards, by the end of this year, probably a B or a B+ would be optimal.
Richard?
I would say we're probably a C+ headed towards a B+. We have diversified folks in front of the camera, as Sean talked about earlier, the work behind the camera, the work in the jobs where leadership and decisions are being made. We have a long way to go. So I would say right now, probably a C+ overall.
Okay, Sean?
I'm always the tough one. When I look now across, and I'm skewed because I think our company's done a really marvelous job on this, but when I look across the industry, these leadership positions, there's not a quick fix to that. I give us a C- or a D+ right now, and I think by the end of this year, I don't think that's even there's not much meaningful change that can happen in 5 months. By the end of next year, I think C+, B-, but it's going to take a lot of very intentional efforts.
I'm hearing audience concurring with that. Sean, Michelle, are you going to be kind, or do you think that C is right?
No, I was all set to say needs improvement, and you said a letter grade, but so I would say C. Yeah, I'm along the lines of a C, but a C with an eager student, if you will, that it's now turning its attention to how it can improve that grade, and so I hope. As Sean just mentioned, that we can look at this a year or so from now and see improvement. But again, this is hard work, and so there's lots to be done.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And on that note, that's all the time we have today for a topic that deserves many more discussions across this industry. And I hope we start to see those happening. I'm personally starting to see them happen with more frequency and perhaps with more commitment. So thanks to all of our panelists for their substantive contributions today. Michelle, Richard, Sean, Danielle. Thanks to the BEA for their help today. And see you again soon for more of our Working Lunch webinars and for our OTT News Summit coming in October. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.